Hello, everybody. Adam Parks here with another webinar with Receivables Info. Today, I've got some great guests in a really interesting topic. Today, we're going to start talking about post-sale support, which I think is really something that's not talked about enough, the importance of post-sale support for debt buyers and what that ultimately means. So for today's discussion, we have Mr. Sam Smith with EverChain, who's
Hello.
managing post-sale support for their organization. And we also have Mellisa Massey with National Credit Adjusters, who's going to kind of give us that debt buyer's perspective. Now, Missy, you've been a frequent guest on a variety of videos that we've done throughout the year. So why don't we kick it off with you? Can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and how you got to the seat that you're in
Sure.
today?
I started in call centers in 1996, so that dates me a little bit, but imagine a big old customer service call center where you used to call your credit card company to ask really basic questions about credit lines and changing your address before the internet, before IVRs took over. But I've been in collections for 25 of those years. I've been on the credit issuer side. I've been at large debt buyers. I've been managing creditors' rights litigation for a good chunk of my executive career. And I started managing purchasing for National Credit Adjusters 5 years ago. So that's where I am today.
Well, it sounds like you've got quite a bit of experience on that debt buying realm and will be able to provide us with the insights today as it relates to being a debt buyer and what post-sale support value is driven from a debt buyer perspective. Sam, you've got a really interesting story as I'm getting to know you today. Can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and how you got to the seat you're in today?
So I actually started my career in a very, very different area. One could say that I started my career in ruins because I followed the goal of every small child who saw Indiana Jones and became an archaeologist. I actually worked in the Pacific Northwest on some different sites on Mount Rainier and the Olympic Peninsula, and then also down the southwestern United States, primarily in New Mexico. After doing that for a couple of years, I decided to change up careers, go for something a little more financial opportunity, and ended up with EverChain. And when I started EverChain, I was actually an SDR. And then I'm quickly moved over to becoming an account manager in around 2020. And since then, I have been running and assisting with the entire post-sale strategy and post-sale area and the client success department. Mm-hmm. And just give some numbers out. I have worked either assisted with, directly actioned, or overseen 260,000 plus post-sale requests since I started with EverChain. So I've been through the ringer on it, and it's been actually a really good experience of seeing the changes we've had since Reg F hit, as well as with some of these mini state regulation changes that have hit throughout the years.
Sure, and I think that's going to provide us some interesting insight today, because just managing that sheer volume, and I think from a brokerage standpoint, you see a lot of volume coming through and have to find systematic ways of bringing together or transferring information between two parties. And so I do want to talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms that you're using to do that today, and kind of talk a little bit through our storyline here. I think as we kicked this off and we said we wanted to do a webinar on post-sale support and kind of what the importance is and some of the tips and tricks that are being used for actually executing on those processes, I think the first thing that comes to mind, Missy, is like, why is post-sale support so important for a debt buyer? Like, why is this a critical business function?
So when we first started our content development and our conversations, it was super technical, right? It was this step and this step and this step and this step. And really what it boils down to is, as a buyer, are you able to service your consumer? And I think what a lot of people don't think about is we're a direct extension of that credit issuer's business, whether they like it or not, right? So they conduct a transaction, they get a wire, we get a data file, everybody moves on and we're happy. Not quite. They need to make sure that we are prepared to act intelligently and compliantly on behalf of them moving forward in our name.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, of course, but it also comes back to like RMAI certification, for example, right? And the documentation requirements that are kind of baked into that program based on the individual product types, right? So it feels like the need for that documentation, right? You can't go forward and sue. You got to be able to validate the debts. I mean, you're using this documentation for a number of different things, and it feels like there's been this kind of extreme evolution over a period of time, right? Because I remember the days when we were kind of managing some of those pieces manually, right, and having to cut up files or to move documentation in a manual way. But it sounds like we've come light years. The systems of record post Reg F and really after the RMAI certification program coming into place have kind of changed the rules of the game a little bit. And it feels like the industry itself has risen to that challenge in terms of managing that documentation.
It really has. So, like from my experience, we go through and we look at post sale as being the key indicator for a healthy partnership between a creditor and a buyer. A lot of cases we look at post sale broken up in 3 different ways. First is efficiency, and this is how much post sale is required for any particular portfolio. A portfolio that's sold or a partnership that starts up that's highly efficient has very minimal amount of post sale requests because media is actioned in bulk at the beginning of the sale. The data files that are being transferred from the creditor to the buyer are incredibly robust, filled with lots of information, not only about that's pertinent to Reg F and the portfolio sale, but also pertinent to the collection strategy, to how things were done, and every bit of information about the accounts themselves. The other ways that we look at this is not just efficiency, but also urgency. How quickly a creditor is able to respond to a debt buyer is incredibly important to the health of the relationship. As Missy knows firsthand, it is being able to get media, being able to get actioned buyback requests, action direct pays are all huge steps to making certain that the partnership lasts and is a great one for both sides. And the last piece is agility. And so agility and urgency sound like they would be the same thing, but basically it's how quick can you catch the monkey wrench before it hits the engine? In the case of Reg F, when that came out, there was a huge push to get media across the line, especially in cases of states like Illinois or Kansas, which started requiring media before you could even collect on it. And that threw a monkey wrench at everyone. What we wanted to do was make certain that that you're able to action this huge spike in post sale without any other part of your post sale processes starting to drop off.
So you're looking at agility as kind of a measurement of how do you react to a critical event, meaning like there's some event, whether it be a mass buyback or whatever the case may be in that debt buyer creditor relationship, and you're trying to measure how quickly and how their reaction to that affects the other post-sale support metrics that you're reviewing. Am I kind of understanding that correctly?
Exactly. And it could be a critical event like a new regulation or a mass buyback. It could also be a surprisingly small event, like just as simple as a person leaving a team or moving on to a new, getting promoted out of that position in sales support. And that's where we see also just some of these big transition pieces hit that you wouldn't think would really affect, but they do. And so it's very important for having a system put in place that's able to manage all aspects of post-sale.
I mean, I know throughout the years I've come across a number of creditors where somebody from that post-sale department ends up managing debt sales in the future. So I think it almost feels like it's a natural progression within some of the creditors. And we saw that a lot, I would say a lot more in the 2008 to 2017 range. But I think you can definitely get a feel for how that has evolved over time. Sam, let me ask you this, we talked a little bit about the importance of post-sale support from the debt buyer's perspective. How about from the creditor's perspective, right? Why does the creditor care so much about quality post-sale support?
So the creditor should care about quality post-sale support, not only from a compliance standpoint, because if their consumers being taken care of by the debt buyer, but they should also really care because of, because of efficiency because of efficiency to the file, as well as the ability to maintain as few post-sale buybacks as possible. Because a post-sale is really showing it shows how well a partnership's going through, but it also is how much money you're able to keep after the sales occurred, because we're going through the repurchasing of accounts always leads into something where we don't want to run into an issue of account.
It's a direct effect on revenue,
Yes.
right? So like
Thank
you're
you.
basically saying that there's a direct effect on the final revenue, because the sale price and then the price of the actual profitability of that sale for them, or the actual revenue for that sale, is going to be reduced by their post-sale support costs, right? So if we're looking at that kind of that downward spiral there, by being a good post-sale support partner, one, they should be able to get more money for their portfolios,
Yes.
right? Like if I'm going to be if I'm the creditor and I'm selling to Missy and I've got great post-sale support, I'm willing to bet that Missy is willing to pay a little bit more for that portfolio, because I'm able to provide a better service, right? It's not just the value of those individual accounts, it's the value of that relationship between the debt buyer and the creditor. Would you say that's true,
Absolutely.
Missy?
And it goes both ways, right? So if I'm a creditor
Mhm.
and I know that my buyer is going to be able to respond to my questions and buyback requests and general inquiry or regulatory inquiry requests promptly, then I'm definitely want to keep them as a business partner, right? And I saw this pop up in the chat and I laughed because emails are better than subpoenas. That's hysterical, but so true, right? Phone calls and emails are handled in an efficient manner are much better than a lawsuit down the road, no doubt.
Yeah, well, or pushing the creditor to have to do something, right? When the creditor is prepared and has the processes, the procedures, the support in place, like Sam kind of pointed out, it is a much smoother operation between the two organizations, because a debt sale transaction is really about it's a long-term partnership. It's almost like a marriage, right? Like you're not in it for one. I believe this is an EverChain line. I think I'm going to quote Daniel Green here, but debt sales is a process, not an event.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think if we look at it from that perspective, I think that rings very, very true as we look at those relationships between the organizations. And Neil, I definitely appreciate the statement about emails are better than subpoenas, right? Like that's a pretty direct and honest answer. And since I see the first message popping up in the chat today, I'm going to encourage everybody that's watching. We've got a fairly big audience today. Feel free to chime in with your thoughts, questions, comments, concerns in the chat. I think these conversations are always a lot more fun when the audience is engaged and involved and kind of speaks their mind, because we have a lot of smart people on stage. We have a lot of smart people in our viewership today. Just looking at the list here, it's kind of exciting to see so many good people coming together. So as we kind of continue down the process of talking about post-sale support, right, we've established the value from the buyer's perspective and from the creditor's perspective, but let's go through and kind of define post-sale support on the whole. And as we were preparing for this, I think we came up with a pretty condensed definition of what we believe to be post-sale support: maintaining a strong, mutually beneficial partnership and relationship between the buyer and seller. We didn't talk, what did we not say in that statement? We didn't say affidavits, right? We didn't say media request. We didn't say buyback request, right? We're talking about how you're lubricating or reducing the friction in that relationship between two parties. But how do you go about doing that? Like, what are some natural steps in creating that positive interaction and that positive experience on both sides?
Due diligence on behalf of both your buyer and your seller, right? So you're going to get a seller that's going to dig in hard. They're going to have questionnaires, they're going to have on-site audits, there's going to be processes, right? And then a lot of those sellers are going to repeat those processes annually. And can I tell you, those are the sellers that are my favorite to work with, because they're invested in their brand. And it really comes down to, are you aligning yourself with a partner that matches your brand profile? Right?
Yeah.
I think that's a great question.
And it's so important.
Yeah.
And from a creditor's perspective.
And on the buyer side, are you doing your due diligence? Do you know, is this seller experienced? Do they have a team to support what your needs are? Are you doing Trustpilot checks and Reddit checks, and then going on to Pacer and doing the important searches, the regulatory searches?
That due diligence, I agree, is a two-way street, right? Because you don't want to go as a debt buyer getting yourself into a relationship with an organization that's not going to support it. And if we go back, I'm going to play historian for a minute, but if we go back to that 06, 07 time block, I mean, there was a lot of times where you'd see a creditor go and make a sale and then go, I have to provide, like, I need people to manage this post-sale support. It was almost like a surprise to some smaller creditors that were entering the market back in the day prior to the 2012 timeframe. Now, I think that's changed pretty exponentially. And I think as we've gone through rulemaking, Reg F, and all of those processes, that the creditors have really kind of taken the bull by the horn, so to speak, in preparing themselves to be able to manage these processes. And Sam, I'm guessing that's something that you're probably seeing over at EverChain.
Yes. So we see a lot of creditors, and for them, it's building out systems and processes, not only to handle just the post-sale side, but also, getting the portfolios put up into a system that you don't need to worry about as much post-sale requests. But when post-sale hits, finding out a process that to send bulk media from the time of sale all the way over to the buyer through a secure transfer system, as well as actioning post-sale requests on an as-need basis. And then also taking care of things like buybacks, managing your chain of title. Was something bought back? Why was it bought back? Do both parties have this saved on their records as well? And then, of course, you have things like direct pays, where you're making certain that funds that are going to a seller from a consumer are being transferred over to the buyer, and that's all being recorded, tracked in one easy, simple location. A lot of times when it comes to,
I was going to say, collecting on accurate balances is a good thing.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. I'm like, that's and it's kind of essential, no?
Oh, it's incredibly essential on our area, and making certain that what I see a lot of times when sellers come in, especially if they've been selling on their own or some of the other areas, is they're using multiple different systems. Each are managed by a couple of different people. And once that person leaves, just like we talked about earlier, throwing that small little monkey wrench in the engine, it causes it to stall, is the system's built around a person rather than the system being a standalone thing you can just kind of plug and play people into. And getting that put together from a creditor side is vastly important.
So you bring up a really good point, Sam, and that's talking about the different systems that exist within a creditor. And Missy, I'm going to be interested to get your point of view on this as well, coming originally from the creditor side. But it's been my experience that when you're dealing with let's call it a mid to large creditor, right? That they basically are going to have a loan management system. They're going to have their MLS or their LMS or their I believe they call it their core system, right? And they may have a totally different collection system, because if they're doing any internal collections, they're probably not managing that through their standard loan management system like Epic or one of those lending platforms, but instead maybe instituting a Latitude or some other collection software. And now they've got two systems that need to talk to each other. And so as accounts are charging off, is the documentation rolling from point A to point B with that? Or are they going to have to reach into multiple systems to collect all the information that they're required to provide at the time of sale? So did you deal with any of that, in your time?
I worked for a credit issuer that had main operations on one system, recovery, forwarding, and tracking on another. And it's challenging, right? I would say my main concern as a buyer is, are you prepared to code all of your systems in a way to which information that isn't accurate can't be shared with the consumer if they contact you, right? And that extends to store locations, brick and mortar branches, right? So it's not just systemic. And I've seen it on both ends, where maybe you're dealing with a credit union or a financial company that lends from a store. And if somebody were to walk into that store after the transaction, are those employees prepared? Do they know? Can they see that, hey, this account's been shut down? Or are they giving inaccurate information? Or are they taking payments that shouldn't be taking?
Mhm.
I've seen a couple of cases where recently I've got lenders that zero out the balances on their accounts, but don't tweak something in their system that doesn't allow a consumer to self-serve from a point of view where they go in and send an inquiry and then they get an email saying their balance is zero. Okay, well maybe
I-
no. Well, then what do you do from that point? You can't work it, right? Credit issuer said the balance is zero. I have to
Well,
shut it down.
you bring up another great point about the branch offices, right? And so like this was big in lease to own years back, where you had the individual stores that weren't necessarily working off the same information as the mothership or the same information that was being passed down. And so I think a lot of systems and processes had to be built for those types of organizations to enable them to bring accurate balances to market. And I think that that took some time, because when you're dealing with these, the local branches tend to have individual relationships with those people, right? With those consumers. And then, is all of that information being systematically tracked, managed, stored, and then kicked up to the debt buyers? And especially when it came to direct payments, that seemed to be a little bit of a challenge in how is this cash flowing? And because it requires multiple, in some instances at least, it requires multiple departments to participate, right? So you're going to have some stuff going on in IT, you're going to have some stuff going on in accounting, right? There's a whole bunch of people that need to come together in order to make sure that the systematic processes that are being put in place make sense.
Yeah. And
so from an go ahead.
well, so I was gonna say it's one of the shoot, I lost my train of thought. My apologies.
That's all right.
No.
So from an ongoing file support perspective, I know that there's a couple of things that we really want to make sure that we're looking at when we're flowing post-sale support. So I know we talked a little bit about account documentation and affidavits. Affidavits were a big challenge 10 years ago. What's it look like today?
From an affidavit side of things, it still is a fairly labor-intensive thing on the parts of the seller. Now, we are seeing that starting to change, especially as more and more sellers are moving to online documentation rather than the physical, just stored at the local branches or in a local regional center. Online documentation has made the affidavit process a lot easier because you're able to pull all the documentation directly from either the seller's internal systems, or they're able to pull it from the sale files that they've sent out already. And so that's where they can go through, make certain it's all set up together, and then take it back to their own team to certify, notarize, and then transfer over to the buyer. The biggest challenge that I see with affidavits as they currently stand is the length of time it takes to get them. In states where affidavits are still allowed, they can take anywhere from that 30-day plus. And as we all know, once a request for validation has been hit 30 days, it's not as you need to close down the account in a certain sense, depending upon the state. Yeah.
I think that extends to general account documentation requests, right? It's not just affidavits, and it depends on what market segment you're sitting in. But in many cases now, most cases, you're getting a download of documents at the point of purchase. And you sift through those and you load them to the accounts. You go about your work, and at some point you may need something supplemental. It's, can you support those supplemental requests? And it's not just if the consumer requests validation, right? Your debt buyers go through all sorts of audits from state licensing entities. And they'll pull random samples of accounts, and they'll say, I need to see all of it for this account. And, maybe you have one out of the two items that you need, and you go back and request the supplemental item. If you can't get that, it's damaging, right?
Yeah. It doesn't look great, right? If you're unable to get the documentation.
We need to maintain our licenses. So for us to be successful and continue business operations, we need to be able to have easy access and quick access to documents when we need them.
No, absolutely. And having everything, instead of having to go through multiple different systems, and that's where a lot of the challenges lie that I've seen, is where it's being pulled. this document from this area, this document from this area, and then getting it all over to the buyer in one concise, clean cut area, rather than needing to check this SFTP, whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Now, Missy, one of the things that you kind of brought up in that discussion was the differences between products, and I think this is one of those areas that often goes overlooked, because there are major differences based on the product type that you're working in. I constantly refer back to the RMAI certification program, and there's a reason that the documentation requirements that are in the certification program are different per account type, because if I'm dealing with auto, I've got repossessions and things that are happening with secured assets. That's different than an online originated loan, right? Like, we're going to be looking at potentially different documentation here. Let's talk a little bit about the kind of the idiosyncrasies that we see between these different types of products.
Yeah, and this is where I suggest at any point that a seller engage with their broker representative or their client directly, and really pre-sale, really understand what's important, right? Because if you're looking at auto deficiencies, now, not something I'm specifically an expert on, I know that there's a lot of requirements from repo notice and resale summaries and letter of deficiencies, things that are required in order to, pursue down a litigation strategy. If you're looking at a fintech lender, that maybe somebody has held multiple investors over the life of the account, what kind of chain of title requirements are there, and can they provide that? Do you know in advance that, hey, lender A had the account originally, transferred it to lender B or servicer B, and now we need to have documentation of that transfer, and then documentation of that transfer to the buyer. So there's certain chain of title requirements for fintech loans. Credit cards are pretty cut and dry, billing statements and loan agreement or credit terms and conditions, right?
Really is a little different everywhere you look, right? And so you kind of got to walk in with a checklist looking at a product and say, what are my post-sale support needs based on my strategy? Because if I'm going to call and collect this, I might have one set of documentation that is like mission critical, right? Yeah. But then if I'm going to litigate, I got a whole other set of documentation on top of that becomes mission critical. And so trying to understand the maze of those things, right? And when we talk about the timing, statute of limitations are ticking away as we're going through the process. And so if we do need additional documentation in that litigation phase, like, how long is it going to take to get it? Or are you going to get it at all? Now, I'm curious from your perspectives, there used to be a time where it was a lot of, we're just not going to get this document. Are you seeing now that you're still finding that we're not going to get this document versus it's just going to take time to get this document? Like, how do you see the balance between those two worlds?
Depends on the product.
Yeah, true.
In some cases, it depends on the product. I would say that a lot of cases we're seeing, especially in the areas that I've seen a lot of work in, which is, some of the fintechs and some of the buy now, pay later, some of those alternative financing sections, is it's getting, creditors are having, as time goes by, an easier time pulling the documentation rather than you're just not going to get it. The biggest area that I see with that kind of issue is typically in things like title loans, where you have the original documentation, the loan agreement, transaction history, and whatnot, that are sent over in a great sale. They're sent over at the time of sale or within 30 days. But it's that extra step, that the titles, if they're not sent over at the time of sale, and if a lien release, say power of attorney for lien release is not provided at the time of sale, instead is done on a request by request basis, that's where you still come into some of these rundowns of it's affecting the accounts and the loans after they've been collected on and closed out.
I mean, the good news is most lenders have moved to a digital form of retention. Applications are either online or on a pad in a store, or digitally captured at a register if they're applying at point of sale. Very, very seldom do you see paper anymore. And ironically, I worked for a credit issuer that used to capture paper right at the service desk. Yeah.
Were you one of the ones sending us truckloads of
No,
documents?
but ours were on microfiche. So you can imagine pulling microfiche rolls and scrolling through them to find copies of original applications back when. I mean, that was a hoot. But the good news is it's available, right? I think really where you're seeing your challenges now is, does your seller have the infrastructure built to be able to identify and batch which documents they need, and can they pull them and bundle them and ship them out?
Yeah.
It's an automation.
It appears that there's been there appears to be a differential in the way that documents are treated at this point, right? So when we had PDFs that were coming over, at the time, you weren't really sticking them into a database, so to speak, right? Like they were being managed almost separate and apart. And I remember building tools that had, I would take this spreadsheet of the accounts that were purchased against this large batch of documentations and pull them out. But then I had to write that code or write that software application for each deal that we did or each creditor that we were doing deals with, because their naming convention would be slightly different. And then this, semicolon or this hyphen that was existing in this naming convention wasn't in that one. And so there was a lot of that. But I think as the technology has advanced over the last 15 years or so, now you're seeing a lot more people that are capable, as the databases and the systems and the really even the servers are more capable now with the cloud and everything else, that we're able to actually manage that documentation in a very different way, to where docs can be attached to individual accounts that can be managed that way, and they can be imported and exported. And same, by my understanding, that's a lot of how you guys are managing things today in terms of managing bulk documentation.
Yes. So what we'll do is we'll sit there, and for bulk at the time of sale is we'll provide that over, usually through an SFTP or through our EverChain platform, in the form of zip folders. So that way you're maintaining the original creditor's naming conventions as well. But then in the platform, we have batch attachment sections for, say, you need 20 posts, you have 20 requests for media documentation. And then working with our teams as well as different buyers and sellers to see if we create a naming convention on the zip folders there that is that's a universal across the board. So that way you can take from that universal, and the APIs that can then be built pull all the same naming conventions and load whatever the documents may be within those individual post-sale requests into the correct spot from the get-go, without needing to go through and then upload and download, double check which one this is. How do I load this into our system? It's take this area, load it directly, and call it a day.
That's funny that you say that, because that was going to be my next point, right?
Yeah.
Putting the docs together is one thing. Is the naming convention intuitive, and can we easily identify, one, what it is, and two, who it goes to? You'd be surprised at how often the answer is no.
Yeah, and getting those polls on our side and trying to build the system to make certain that it is a universal thing, so that way whether you're talking about seller A or seller B or seller T, way down the line, it's all, you have the same system, and you're not needing to worry about that.
Well, you've become a conduit for a lot of documentation and deals to flow through a particular platform. So I think this is one of those unique opportunities for an individual business to help kind of manage that process, right? Because you become that conduit between two worlds. And if everything matches the same schema, the same management style, right? If it matches the same way, you're able to set an expectation for that data. So I'm assuming, Missy, your team has probably built APIs or connections into however it is that you're connected into EverChain, to be able to extract that information and documentation if you were making a purchase from an organization like theirs, and get that into your system of record for management.
So I'd like to say that yes, but we're working on it, right? And I think that's another really good point from are you building a process, and do you have a system in place? Because we've gone through that learning curve as well. You go from, hey, I need a couple docs here and there, to I need everything. Are you ready to receive that and process it efficiently?
Yeah.
It's all fun and games till the data
right?
shows up,
And
right?
then holy cow, what do you do with it? So it's really important to think about as you're getting into bulk buying.
Mhm.
Do you have the processes in place on your end to receive and process?
It's almost like one of those be careful what you wish for scenarios, right? Like, you want all the documentation in the world. When it gets here, are you prepared to categorize, sort, and manage that documentation in conjunction with all of the data that's related back to your accounts
And then,
themselves,
yeah,
right? Like,
audit to it, right? Did I get everything? Do you have a
mhm.
system that easily tells
Sure.
you, hey, you're missing something, you should go request it quickly?
Well, and I think it goes back, another thing that I saw years ago, and I haven't seen it as much lately, and I feel like we found other workarounds, was optical character recognition, or OCR. So I remember a point in time, I want to say it was about 5 to 7 years ago, where organizations were working with the OCR technology from Adobe and other companies to try and be able to read what was in a particular statement or an application file, and then to try and understand that and be able to sort and manage those things. I feel like that was a solution that was like when the world was still converting from kind of paper or even just a scanned copy of some paper, right? Because a digitally created PDF and a scanned PDF have very different properties in terms of how you can manage that document. Right. So if I take a document and I take a picture of it with my phone, I now have a picture of that document, right? Like that text is not manipulatable. I can't read it. I can't leverage OCR versus if I were to print to PDF, I could still have some of that text overlaid because PDFs will start to layer, the information within them. And I saw a lot of that early on. I haven't seen as much of it lately. And I feel like part of that is due to the systematic management of it, that we're now able to get the documents into the database. But are you guys seeing anybody using optical character recognition or OCR these days?
I am not. And
I may have gone full nerd
to.
here.
I
So
want to, but I am not. But I got to laugh because Adam, I've recently seen a media example where somebody literally took out a file and took a picture and thought that was good. So
I was only joking about the picture piece. I was just trying to
it's happened in
illustrate
the
the
last 6
differences.
months. Not gonna lie.
Oh, it makes my
A little
heart
bit,
hurt.
right? So I think there's definitely a spectrum out there still, and where we're moving in a really good direction. There's definitely opportunity for new sellers to really understand what the requirements are.
Yeah.
There's also an opportunity to drive more value for the portfolios that you're selling in the marketplace by having those things in place, because that flow of documentation, like bringing this conversation full circle back to where we started, there's a lot of value for the creditor in making sure that post-sale support is top of the mind as they're preparing for sale.
Yep.
Because if you have that documentation together and you've got the right KPIs and the buyers are feeling confident about your ability to perform your obligations under the contract, well, people are willing to pay a little bit more for confidence, right? Especially when you're buying distressed assets. So the higher the confidence level we have in the proper representation of the portfolio, the more comfortable we are bidding on those portfolios and potentially pushing on price.
Correct. And back to
Yes.
your OCR argument, it is, from what I understand, a great tool. And if you have it in advance of receiving massive amounts of documentation, you're in a much better position.
Yeah, but some of the challenges that come with that is if the documentation is different. So if you bought a pool that was issued by, let's say, a major bank, but under that you've got 25 different brands with 25 different statement types or statement formats, you're going to have to code a whole bunch of that to help the computer understand what it is that it's seeing. Right? Like the computers, I don't think at this point, I'm sure that there's some AI technology that's being experimented in all of that. Although, AI, I feel like is like the dirty word these days. If we're talking from a regular standpoint, but I feel like there's some real opportunity there in understanding how these documents flow and driving additional value by being able to add confidence to the debt buyer.
And then I think we go back to the argument of, is the naming convention of your files intuitive?
Yeah.
But think about how small of a thing that is, but how major of a ripple effect that it has across a transaction.
100%.
So managing that and having those naming conventions, and again, I think that comes down to confidence level and accuracy level, right? And Sam, that kind of goes back to some of the measurements that you were talking about earlier in terms of how are you determining what is good or bad post-sale support? Like, what does that actually mean? How do we make a relative decision?
So
or a relative evaluation?
So a lot of times what we look at it is, how, I'm going to pick on efficiency, because that's that's one of the biggest key indicators of if post-sale support really being functioned. Is the partnership really good? And that's where the more post-sale requests you need after the sale, clearly you're able to see that either media wasn't being provided in full at the time of sale, or you're able to show that, hey, if media was provided, and that's still fairly high. Okay, then now we have an issue with the robustness of the sale file. Are things that should have been talked about for a collectability standpoint, for a regulatory standpoint, actually being filled in? And how do we make certain that's all being taken care of? But I will say on the other point too, so even with clients who still aren't able to provide media at the time of sale, that urgency and agility factor right there is probably the biggest thing. And we're able to actually show that in our platform to go through of just like, hey, you may end up with a fair amount of post-sale requests, but the urgency, the quickness of them overall is incredibly fast, comparatively speaking, to other areas. And even if the urgency doesn't change as you see agility markers really shoot up with that proverbial monkey wrench, if you will.
Well, and if something goes horribly wrong and you weren't expecting it, and you've got to be all hands on deck, right? On one issue, does everything else fail? Are you dropping the ball on everything else?
And that goes right into the combination of urgency as well as agility right there. Because if you see agility shoot up and basically a big spike right there, and then you watch urgency just start to go up across the board with different post-sale request types, different whole regions of it, then you know that the system has broken at that point. And so you need to make certain that the systems, that whatever the seller is using is flexible enough to handle the changes, those monkey wrenches, while also not dropping the other sections of post-sale.
I think you've come up with an important measurement there, right? And saying that if all hands on deck to one item, what happens to everything else? And I think that's one of the detriments from a creditor standpoint, where if there's a large or small event, like you pointed out, somebody switching teams, being promoted, it could all be positive things that are happening within the creditor's organization. But how does that affect the debt buyer themselves? Because the debt buyer only has one key question when it comes to post-sale support when they're looking at the creditor, and that's, can you deliver on your promises?
Yeah. And
right, you're promising a lot in this contract, but like, can you live up to the expectations and to the agreement that you've executed?
And I think that it goes both ways, right, Sam?
Yep,
it does.
100% goes both ways, and being able to track that across the board really shows strong partnerships and strong systems at place versus even just strong people in place versus systems.
Just training and redundancy, right, on both sides is important. And I think we've learned that lesson on our end as well. You have an expert or somebody who handles an incredible amount of work that you maybe don't realize. That person leaves the company and all of a sudden you have a million inquiries. Well, Jen was handling that. Oh, okay. Let's figure that out.
And that's actually goes into another line too of open communication. If you're a seller going directly to a buyer, to open lines communication there. And for my team, open lines communication with both parties to make certain that, hey, okay, so what's going on here? We had a person leave. Perfect. Let's go in. Our team is going to help you with retraining, setting the boundaries, getting everything squared away for you to be able to make certain your business and none of the balls get dropped when that event happens.
And additionally, who's the backup now?
Exactly. Who's the backup? And then setting up, okay, who's the backup's backup?
Exactly.
If you get two people promoted, what happens then?
Yeah. Now, now what? Hey, we've done such a great job that we've left, gaps and holes in the management process, which I think is a little bit scary. Um, you know, I I think it's interesting, Sam, the way that you guys are looking at these measurements and KPIs, because as I think about post-sale support, I feel like it's historically been an afterthought for some creditors, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like this dirty word in the corner that they're going to just throw one or two resources at and hope that it goes away, right?
Yeah.
And I hate seeing a creditor be surprised about the level of work that's required post-sale, but I think there's a direct correlation between the fee or the purchase price that someone's willing to pay and the cooperativeness of that debt seller or that creditor, right?
Yeah.
So it looks like you guys have found some interesting ways to measure that across a larger volume. Because if you had 100 small debt buyers that were, measuring these things internally, does the creditor ever truly believe the data that's being presented to them? Because they're always going to look at it and say the sample's too small.
Yep.
But in your case, you're able to show a much larger data sample and say this is how you are behaving in the marketplace, because sometimes it's not so obvious in real time, right? Whether or not this creditor is truly cooperative or not, but having some data points, but not only data points, but data trends to go back and take a look at and to try to understand not only what is happening, but what's happening over time.
Yeah. And that's actually been, and I will say that while Ref really threw in a lot of those monkey wrenches, it really did allow for post sale to get viewed as the true importance that it actually has to the partnership, to compliance, to every little bit. Because that's when, looking back at pre-Reg F versus post-Reg F, I'm actually seeing the numbers of post sale requests going down continuously since Reg F has hit. And that's because people are providing
does that measurement
files.
Okay. I was going to say, does that measurement include those accounts that are being put up front at the time of sale?
Yes. So that measurement is an overall compared with that measurement covers that whole 260,000 plus post sale requests that I've been a part of since joining this department. And we're seeing, when I first joined, there was 80,000 in a 6-month period. Now we're down to around that 25, 30,000 across the network. And so it's not just one particular sale, not any one particular seller. It's everyone. And so it's seeing that trend of it going down as people are really focusing on robust sales, on making certain their post sale is going to be taken care of, which is now a bigger factor, especially in onboarding creditors to our platform, of making certain, hey, where are you at? What are you used to? And what is to be expected? And really being able to work with them to bring them from what they're used to kind of what they might run into after their sale.
So I kind of have a question I'd like to ask it to both of you. We can kind of go at it one at a time, because I think you're coming at this from different perspectives. But what steps are you taking to train a creditor on what post-sale support means and how, in the criticalness of that process to your transaction with them?
So in my area, what we do is so let's take a creditor who's brand new to the platform. We go through the onboarding stages of prepping them for what they're going to be expecting for the file, making certain we cover every different aspect that we're seeing being asked for by our debt buyers. And, if that means adding columns such as things like refinance, if something is a live check versus an in-store loan, that kind of deal. As well as at that point, finding out, how does your post-sale look? Say you haven't sold, but you're just working with agencies. How's your agency post-sale look currently compared to what I'm seeing in the platform for how you're going to be able to provide media up front versus media at the time of sale? And then working with them, prepping them at the beginning. This is what we're going to be talking about. You're going to see numbers, and my team and I are going to be there with you the entire time. As soon as it's sold, we're scheduling a post-sale training call, go through that, every aspect of the platform, the importance of it, as well as what the different types mean, and then follow that up with what we do is a bi-weekly or month, and even bi-weekly calls that can sometimes graduate to monthly calls of just, where you at? What are you running into? Let's find any of these. Hey, I'm starting to see this breakdown in our post-sale internal system. Okay, here's how we utilize our systems with yours to keep this flowing, to keep your partnership at peak levels.
I think that's a very fair approach to it. Now, Missy, from your perspective, it's a little bit different, right? Because you're not pushing them through a technology platform. I mean, I'm sure that you're leveraging some technology in that process, but like, how do you, when you meet a new creditor who hasn't sold before, how are you helping to educate them on like the value of
Right.
post-sale
The
support?
topics are all the same, right? It's not technology driven. It's the same
Yeah.
topic.
Okay.
And a lot of times what they don't want to hear is start small. Let's ease into it gradually. Let's start with a small segment. Get an understanding of what kind of resources that's going to require on your end in the upcoming months. And then push forward. Dip your toe in the water, understand what kind of resources you're going to need, and then build your process, build your team. But I think it really comes down to any type of coaching and relationship. The time investment pays off in spades, right?
And
that sounds pretty accurate.
Actually, to build off of that as well, is when it comes to resources, because I have such a large sample size across different asset types, different portfolio, media being provided up front, this different kind of post-sale stuff, it is nice to be able to tell a new debt buyer, especially, or new creditor, I should say, especially, that, hey, this is what you're looking at. This is how much you're looking at selling. This is what I'm seeing across across other creditors for how many people you should have in place. How many people it's going to take for you to be able to sell this much debt versus a smaller amount in a forward flow. And so things can kind of be able to be pulled back, and it's nice to be able to actually present that data to them as just here you are. Here's your standard. Let's follow that.
Well, and it's not a face value conversation, right? It's account volume.
It's account exactly.
Yeah.
All about the account volumes, because face value that can change on product type, but account volume, like if it's 25,000 accounts versus 250,000 accounts.
Well, given the same product type, of a balance of $1,000 and a balance of $100,000 requires the same documentation.
Yeah.
Right. So we're pretty much looking at many of those same things. But see, I really liked what you said about kind of the baby steps, right? You find a creditor, it's not just about, can I jump in with both feet immediately, or it's not how fast can I close the deal, it's how fast can I get you up to speed, right? How can I help you take these baby steps to make sure that you understand the commitment that you're making when you sell this debt? Right? What kind of resources are going to be required after the fact? And, obviously, Sam, from your perspective, that's the value of kind of being in the middle of those transactions and helping to facilitate and reduce friction between buyers and sellers, especially from a post-sale support standpoint, and kind of balancing all of that. I think this has been a very interesting conversation. With just a few minutes left here, I definitely want to open this back up to anybody who has any questions, comments, or concerns that are watching. And there was one other thing, Missy, that I wanted to go back to that you had mentioned. That was about fintech chain of title. And I know that we do have one person watching here who has spent the last couple of years, I won't call you out by name, but we know that you've been spending the last couple of years here really working with those creditors to educate them on what chain of title really needs to look like from that standpoint. Have you seen a change in the marketplace, Missy, in terms of the understanding of a fintech as to what chain of title requirements look like in the post-sale world?
Definitely, but there's still opportunity, right? Especially as it comes to more alternative, high risk, high interest lenders, where they're engaging in bank partnerships now, and that's a newer product for them, where it was state licensed for many years, and now maybe they're dealing with a bank chartered group out of Utah or Kentucky or whatever state, Ohio.
That was real specific.
And they're using that bank charter to export their rates across state lines. There is a chain of title requirement there where the original bank transfers to the servicer, who is probably your seller, and that's not always captured. So as
Mhm.
as those products evolve, right? There's opportunity, and I've been
Sure.
blessed to be a part of that group and learn from that specific person, right? So I can educate my sellers as they enter selling those product types and entering the market. I'm prepared to have those conversations.
That's good. It feels like as an industry, we're better prepared to have those discussions, and we've got documentation and information to provide to help get those creditors to where they need to be to maximize the value of their portfolios for both them and for the debt buyer, right? It's that fine balance, but I guess everything good in life comes down to finding balance, right? And so hopefully we're going to find that post-sale support balance here and continue to find that for our industry. With just a minute left for kind of each of you, any closing statements you'd like to make about post-sale support, or really anything that you feel like talking about today?
I'll go back to the chain of title conversation real quick. The RMAI FinTech Working Group had a white paper published a little over a year ago, and it covers a lot of really great topics, specifically chain of title. So if that's something that's piqued your attention and you want to learn more about it, go to the RMAI website, find that resource, download it. It's a good read.
Awesome. Thank you.
And I would
Sam,
say,
anything from your side?
If you're looking to start getting and selling debt, always look for something that's, like EverChain, we provide every piece of the debt of the post-sale system in one. I know that there are different systems where you can provide some media, some buyback and all that and cobble it together. But anytime that you can be able to simplify your systems to put into one system and make it go through the entire thing, that's going to be the best bet for any post-sale management going forward.
I heard keep it simple, keep it consistent.
Yes. Simple, consistent.
That will be our Adam interpretation for the day. So guys, I really want to thank you for coming on and chatting with us today. I think this was a really great discussion. I think post-sale support is an incredibly important piece of the debt buying puzzle, and both of you coming from different perspectives really added some great color and flavor to our discussion today. For those of you that are watching, if you have friends that you want to share this with, we'll be posting it to the Receivables Info YouTube channel on Friday so that you can share this out and allow other people to check out this content. Again, I want to thank you guys for coming on today and helping me continue to create great content for a great industry. I look forward to seeing you guys at upcoming conferences throughout the year this year. Maybe we could sit down, have a drink, talk a little post-sale support. But until next time, thank you guys so much for coming on today. I really appreciate you.
Thank you, Adam.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody watching, and we'll see you again soon.
Talk to y'all later.